We're going to swiftly move to India now, where the paradigm is changing very rapidly. I'd like to invite Harjeev Singh, who's going to be moderating the session between Vani, Kola and Anshuman.
Good afternoon. My name is Harjeev Singh. I'm the founder and CEO of Brain Global. I'm actually excited to be part of this panel, and I'm glad we're right after China, because while China works with the help and enablement of the government to a large extent, India works quite the opposite in spite of the government. And so we've got two great panelists, Vani Kola to my right, who, if you see her bio, it says that she's a trend spotter and an ideas lover, and that is manifested in the fact that she runs one of the most successful early stage venture capital companies in India, has been a serial entrepreneur. She studied electrical engineering in the US, had a software company which she sold, and went down the path of being a venture capital and enabler for the Indian economy to a large extent. And welcome, Vani. I have to my left AnshumanBapna, who is the Chief Product Officer at Goibibo. Don't go by the title. He's also a serial entrepreneur, a Stanford MBA, and does some fantastic, has done a lot of work in the travel industry, and you'll hear a lot more about that. Without further ado, I'm going to start with the first question. And the way we're sort of thought through this panel was to really look at giving you a big macro perspective and then delve down into sort of more of the investment experiences and how do you think about India as if you were looking at India as an investment destination. Vani, I'll start with you. What has your experience been in the Indian economy in the last 10 years? How's that entire ecosystem for entrepreneurs and investors changed?
No, I went back to India in 2006, which was really early for the Indian sort of startup ecosystem, and venture capital was almost non-existent. And many times, in fact, capital that was available in that region was either debt or collateralized investment of some sort. So in the beginning, kind of the knowledge of the venture capital would be when we say we're interested in something, somebody would actually ask me in the early 2006 to say, what is it that you want collateralized, right? So obviously that's not what venture capital is. But today, when I go into sort of an MBA class in IIM or ISB or whatever and just ask how many of you would like to be entrepreneurs, invariably 90+% of the hands go up, and that's true in most of the undergrad institutions also. So as Ken, I think, was saying earlier about entrepreneurship, the same thing in India. I think in a decade, the fundamental change is people want to be entrepreneurs. That's a aspiration. And one thing that has changed that I see is also sort of the age bracket. And let me explain. There are startups that are sort of, let's say, blue swan, rethinking something. It might work, might not work. But there are also big problems that require significant domain expertise. So we actually are seeing entrepreneurs that are, say, 40 plus, which is very uncool in Silicon Valley. But I think in India, we have a company that's solving, for example, a specific problem in the financial services banking industry. For that, I think the entrepreneurs who are doing that come from 20 plus years of deep experience having worked in that sector. So that kind of sectorial experience also we are seeing. So I kind of see two buckets, right? The typical young entrepreneur and also a more experienced executive who wants to be an entrepreneur. And I say that because for Indian cultural evolution to reach this place of risk-taking and confidence to be an entrepreneur, which by definition implies there is a probability of failure also, is a big thing, I think. So venture capital has also grown, but capital in India still is not that local. It's changing. And it's changing, it has changed significantly at the angel level. There's a lot of angel investment happening in the market, but there is very limited growth investment from India. It is still the large globals that come and do the growth investment. And there are maybe a dozen or so like us, early stage venture funds that do the Series A, Series B. So that's sort of a quick summary.
Great, thanks, Vani. Anshuman, coming to you, you were an entrepreneur at IIT when you were a student, and you've kind of seen India's journey over the last couple of decades. Walk us through an entrepreneurial perspective on India.
Sure.
How's it been? How's it changed? Because it has changed dramatically.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, so don't go by the way I look. I've actually been around for decades, and back in the day, almost 20 years ago, 1999 is when I started my first company, internet company based out of the IIT campus. Then I started my second company in India in 2009, so a decade later, and it's 2019. So we're just getting started with this year. But it's just been a complete transformation, and I think if I have to kind of put it in the simplest possible way, what I have seen is that the metabolic rate of the Indian entrepreneurial ecosystem has just doubled or tripled. So even if you just look at the last 10 years, since 2009, India's GDP is almost double of where it was. What's more interesting is that the amount of venture capital coming into India is actually 10x of what it was in 2009. I believe 1.2 billion in 2009, 12, 13, 14 billion right now. Roughly about 15x the scale of what MENA is, but 8x smaller than China. So you can see how much headroom there's still to grow. And to me, the thing that I find most exciting about both as an entrepreneur and as an angel is the quality of entrepreneurs. And I'm seeing exactly what Vani is also talking about. I'm seeing return entrepreneurs, meaning people who have done one successful startup, actually finding the market to have enough depth to come back and do their next big one, happening over and over again. I'm also seeing another kind of entrepreneurs which are always there, which are people like me who did a startup, who were US educated, came back to India to start a company. We definitely see those kinds as well. But the third and the most exciting ones that I see now are the ones who are kids, as I call them, kids who have seen nothing but hyper growth. They've worked in these internet companies where everything goes up by triple-digit percentage points every year, and they don't know any better, quote unquote. And that naive optimism about how growth, above all else, obviously has some disadvantages, but is just fueling this metabolic rate in India in such a massive way that literally every year the quality of entrepreneurs that I see is just going up by this very noticeable percentage. So to me, I think it's a fantastic time to be around.
And to your point, Anshuman, I think a lot of people don't realize today India is the third largest entrepreneurial ecosystem in the world. US and China are the two countries ahead of India. What are some of the macro trends driving this growth? Anshuman referred to some of this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, Mani.
I think there are 3-4 macro trends, which are, I think, obvious, but there is some derivatives of that are very important. First of all, India is a young nation. I think 45% of the workforce today are millennials, and in 2020 that reaches an astounding 65% of the workforce is millennial. India will supply 30% of the global workforce in the next decade. So I think there is a millennial framework that is sometimes called a demographic dividend. That's a significant advantage for India, and they are spending. So there is a rising spending, GDP, like Anshuman said, but also if you look at where their disposable income is, from the rise of wallet spend on FMCG and housing and the non-essentials, as in home spend, so on and so forth. I think there is a rising spending in India, not only from the GDP tripling, but contribution tripling, but also in the context of where the disposable income and the discretionary spend is happening. So I think that's another aspect. But the data penetration is actually being a very interesting story from many parameters, right? So there are 450 million internet-enabled users today. Data is one of the cheapest, globally. Interestingly, for India, it's I think it's a 10x cheaper than UK or US from a data perspective, and that shows up in, I think, today versus just about 5 years ago. There is 450 million users on YouTube. I think 5 years ago that was like 20 million or something like that. That's an astounding rise, but 2+ hours average spend a day on digital content consumption, and that story also plays out into digital inclusion on many things. I think UPI, which is sort of a payment infrastructure that again makes it equitable to potentially achieve this digital inclusion. So payments, you can do a company with value add on top of payment, but payment itself from a transaction cost is very, very negligible because of this payment layer UPI which the government enabled. But the number of transactions, digital transaction have exceeded on the UPI layer to I think accumulative over 10 billion or something like that right now. And so I think there is a digital story that's happening in India. There is, I think, a notion that more than 60% of the GDP will have some kind of a digital footprint. So the story of India is really about how we create at every level this digital inclusion, and that's the opportunity.
Yeah, and to add to Vani's point, I think a lot of people outside of India may not have heard about the India stack. And what she referenced, the UPI and the mobile enablement is a very important part of what the government actually is doing on India. I took a dig at the government.
One point to that is, India had only 30% of its adult population have bank accounts as late as, let's say, 2009, 2010. And today, 80% of the adult population has a bank account, right? And it has to do with this eKYC and so on and so forth. And for, and that type of inclusion is very important for the growth that we are seeing.
Right. And Anshuman, maybe a little bit on some of these macro trends, more from a perspective of what you're seeing.
Yeah.
And if you could weave in some of the stuff from the
Sure.
industry, I think that'd be great.
No, absolutely. And by the way, Vani is talking about two phenomena, which I think, I've worked in the Valley, I've worked in India, I've seen what's happening in China. One of our biggest investors is MENA, which is China's largest travel company, so familiar with that ecosystem. And just these two things that Vani just talked about are unprecedented in scale, and I can see that how they impact my day-to-day life running India's largest travel company. So the first thing that Vani was talking about, which was data. So literally it costs 26 cents for 1 GB of mobile data, which is actually not 10x, but 50x cheaper than the US. So 50x cheaper. So what that has done really is that, in my opinion, it has unlocked India's id, right? All these primary emotions that Indian consumers always had have been unlocked by apps like TikTok, apps like ShareChat, and the kind of scale that you're seeing of people expressing themselves on these apps, live streaming themselves at massive scale, and even buying e-commerce products is just this massive unlock that happened literally in the space of about 2 years. Like 2016 June is when this new network came online and suddenly everything changed. That's one. Second is the India stack, which is UPI, which is basically an interbank transfer. What that means is that potentially India would be one of the first few countries in the world, large countries in the world, where MasterCard and Visa might not have a business. Right? Imagine that happening, and imagine the amount of efficiency it brings in unlocking the entire value chain and the entire ecosystem. And at Makemytrip, which is the travel company that I represent, we have gone from essentially zero to about 1/3 of all our payments already happening on UPI, which means that there's no interchange fee, there's no MasterCard, Visa, there's instant refunds. The kind of customer experience in that is just phenomenal. And on all the devices that come and use Makemytrip, half of them are now on Jio, literally half, and that happened in the space of 2 years. So this is the kind of unprecedented scale that is happening. I think the other thing I wanted to add to what Vani and Harji, what you were saying, which is, and I'm bringing in a Chinese phrase here, which is, if you have, apparently the Chinese phrase is that if you want to prosper, then you have to stay away from the gaze of the emperor. And that's kind of what happened in India, which is Bangalore, which is kind of a bit of this backwater colonial town, which all the retired people used to live there. And there was, and all Indian politics and Indian government is very north-focused, turned out to have been completely a blind eye. And lo and behold, within the space of a single generation, you first had the entire services industry blooming and coming in with a total market cap almost of about $100 billion plus. And then just within that generation itself, another internet generation coming up with a similar kind of a market capitalization. So all of that is happening. And thankfully, Bangalore has been able to, and Bangalore, not just Bangalore, but India has been able to do it despite the best efforts of the government sometimes. We keep running into all kinds of things, well-intentioned things that the government wants to do, but has unintended consequences. The other effect of that, however, which for Makemytrip, for example, which is the #1 player in travel in India, is that you're actually competing every single day with the best in the world. So what that means is that Makemytrip's competitor list is not just the travel players inside India, it's also a Booking.com, which is a $100 billion company sitting out of Europe and America. It's also Alibaba, who wants to invest via Paytm and take on the travel market. And this is happening every single day. And the capital flows are not, again, restricted by any geography. So you have Japanese capital coming in through SoftBank, you have Chinese capital coming in through Alibaba and everyone else. You have not as much Middle Eastern money as I would like it to be there, but you have tons of US capital also coming in. So it's almost like this, I almost like to think of it as a survival of the fittest kind of an ecosystem, which is, yes, we would love to have an ecosystem where, especially as an incumbent, where there are all kinds of protectionist barriers that prevent Chinese companies or American companies from coming in. But the reality is that it is not the way India has developed, and it's that bus has definitely left the station. So therefore, for us, it is very important to actually survive every day on the merit of product, distribution, sales, and so on. So very, very interesting ecosystem.
We'll kind of dive a little more into the consumer demand that's kind of driving India in general. And just to give you a flavor, India, everybody thinks is a monolithic country. It's not. The 30 states that comprise India, you've got 17 constitutionally recognized languages, different cultures, food, cuisine varies northeast, southwest, physiognomy varies. But tell us what you're seeing in the tier 2, 3 towns, because you've invested in a lot of consumer companies as well. Maybe a little bit about the consumer demographics in India and how that's changed.
Way back in 2008, which was very early, we started investing into horizontal e-commerce companies, which of course you can't do today because that sort of window is, there are different windows to invest into different opportunities. But our thesis then, from a just macro perspective, and sometimes you have to look at life from outside in, said it makes all the sense. Though at that time there was very few credit cards in India, still true, but and logistics is very broken in India. So there are all kinds of reasons. Usually, what we discuss in our team when we look at a new investment is there's always, 99 reasons why this won't work. But we have to really, really understand the one reason why it could work, and if it does, whether you could create a very big, massive outcome. So that's, and why I'm saying that is we invested very early into e-commerce, and what we started seeing, even back then, even before this level of data penetration, was orders coming from cities. I mean, my geography knowledge may be not the best, but nonetheless, cities we had never heard of, right? And very quickly,
the need to guarantee that you can have it straight away. What's happening now with these substance requirements is that more and more jurisdictions are saying that we see that you are in a low tax environment. We believe that you are there because it's a low tax environment, not because you're there doing business. So we will not acknowledge your right.
2008 to invest into a company that's talking about, a fashion statement, and fashion is what we live and breathe, is, sort of a bit far-fetched, but we liked the entrepreneur, we liked what he was saying. 60% of their orders were coming from non-metros because there is a huge consumer aspiration. There isn't an access. There is very limited retail penetration. Retail in India is very expensive, but also from a density perspective, you can't really have that kind of retail into tier 2, tier 3 cities. So today, much of the growth, we have sort of the top 50 million metro users were, let's say, the first wave, and the next 300, 400 million Indian users that are now data enabled is where the next big opportunity is. That also presents a very interesting vernacular opportunity, because India many people know has a very large English speaking capability, but about 125, 150 million Indians can speak English very well. And even there's a preference of consuming news in local language and so on and so forth. So the India opportunity next wave is really around the tier 2, tier 3 and the vernacular opportunity. There is very different behavioral models that we see emerging from that. So anyone who is investing into India today has to also think about what does that opportunity represent, the 400 plus million, digital transacting potential, and how you unlock that.
Yeah, maybe I'll
Like
just I'll just add an example. I think Vani is absolutely right. Just to put some color on that. So imagine this fact number one, that there are dozens of these different languages, each of them with user bases of tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions. Second, this very strong trust or lack of it kind of an economy where you actually buy or you actually transact or you actually interact with people whom you really are close to and can actually physically reach out to. And then combine that with an ecosystem where an Amazon or an Alibaba can come in just as easily and play just as easily. So how do you compete as an entrepreneur in an environment like that? And it's actually one of Vani's companies called Shop 101. Also another competitor called Meesho. What they've done is that they've realized that Indians are WhatsApp users. So imagine that you actually got your local neighborhood reseller, or actually somebody you, most likely an acquaintance, somebody you already knew, who would sell garments and apparel to you over WhatsApp. Now that is obviously happening in a language that you're already comfortable with. It's already happening by someone whom you can reach out to in case there are customer support issues. And this is a channel that an Amazon or Alibaba does not even know how to tap into right now. So you suddenly have, out of literally nowhere, almost like a $500 million company coming out of nowhere in the space of 12 months to 18 months. So that's a kind of pressure cooker, survival of the fittest kind of situation that India has been able to manufacture. And just to put a point to that.
One more question to both of them, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. Vani, in terms of what's been the most surprising experience you've had as a venture investor in India?
Well, one good, one bad, maybe. Both sides of the coin, right? I think the pace of growth sometimes that can happen, like Anshuman said, there's a model that can evolve very, very quickly, which is what happened with ShareChat and, this model around social commerce, selling on WhatsApp, selling on Instagram, just how fast it has taken off in India. So some of the models, when they click, I think just 2 days back, we saw Byju's reaching 5 billion, and that model of, then that's just supplemental education, right? That's not a school, that's not, and I think you would find very few schools that are worth $5 billion, but this is just supplementing what, parents want to spend on their children because they don't think school is teaching them enough, or you want to give a leg up to your children or whatever, and that becomes the most valuable education company versus a company that's actually involved in primary education of children. So I think these are, sort of the unique India insights, so to speak. So some of these growth happens very quickly. So as a venture firm, for us, it's always looking at these very emerging themes, and some of them when they work, there is a very big scale factor that India provides because of the population and other demographic factors, right? Now, at the same time, so that's the positive. So we could, I believe India will manufacture or create or contribute rather, maybe that's the right word, will contribute over the next decade to a maximum number of unicorn companies. And that's what keeps me on my toes, excited, open and paranoid, right? And you have to be all those three things to be in venture business, at least I feel. So that's, I think, the part of what is great about being in India and being in what I do, which I think is a big privilege to be able to work with young entrepreneurs like that. But the other side of the coin is like what Anshuman said. There are entrepreneurs that have never seen, a down round. They don't know what that is, and and there are behavioral models that will be corrected. The question of who, when, where, and you can see from me that I must have seen enough down rounds, and I've seen the 2000, 2008. In fact, I sold my company in year 2000, so I know what it's like when your stock price goes down by 80% or something like that, and so on and so forth. I sold before it went down, but that's a different story for a different time. But and so it takes different energy and different nerves to be able to work through that kind of situation. And no market is immune to this, and India hasn't seen that kind of a correction. So we have entrepreneurs who have only seen a lot of up rounds, and it creates a certain arrogance, certain naivete, I think. So that's the downside.
On that note, as an entrepreneur who sort of sold his company and now at the largest sort of travel company in India, just a little bit of your own personal experience and sort of where do you think the ecosystem is today and where do you see the next step?
Sure. So I think the fundamental takeaway for me, both from my own startups and from what I've been seeing at Makemytrip as part of the leadership team, is that India feels like playing three-dimensional chess all the time. So you're not just competing with folks in your own stack, a price disruptor at the bottom and a premium player at the top, maybe a global premium player at the top. That's kind of the traditional basis of competition. You also wake up one fine morning and you realize that your payment provider has become your biggest competitor. And then another day you wake up and you think you have a strategy around that. Another day you wake up and you realize that as a travel company, we work with hotels, with hotel chains. And one fine day you realize that your biggest hotel chain has become your biggest competitor. So and all of that is happening on mobile, which until a few years back was at the same primitive level of understanding as desktop used to be back in 2000, where I don't know how many of you remember when we used to talk about how many eyeballs your website is getting, or how many hits, and we kind of laugh at those metrics now. But that's what India was until 2-3 years back, and we were playing with all of those dimensions simultaneously. So I think to me it's this whole process of creative destruction that India is going through right now. One of the things that I think I just wanted to add to Vani's point is that maybe not enough creative destruction is happening in India, despite all the massive innovation in models. The fact that Makemytrip, my company, has been around for 20 years now. 20 years is positively dinosaurian in internet times, and yet here we are. And we're not the only one. There are actually multiple companies that should have been disrupted in one way or the other. So there is almost this disconcerting feeling that I have as an entrepreneur sometimes, which is that, hey, much as I would hate to say this, I think we need some kind of a correction so that the best breed of entrepreneurs, the best breed of investors, long-term thinkers manage to build this economy to its true scale. And that's what the long-run game should look like.
Great, thanks, Anshuman.
And Harjeev, can I just take a minute to add sort of actually
Sure.
One of the reasons why I was attracted to come here, among many things, concept of a global university and the format of this event itself, but on a more sort of self-serving basis. For a lot of Indian companies, just not long ago, going global meant going to the US, really, right? Today, going global means something else. It's Southeast Asia, this whole UAE, MENA region, and they don't look to say, I'm going to US, right? And in fact, in our own portfolio, we have, half a dozen companies that are already doing something or trying to do something here. And hence, as a venture capitalist, in fact, we are following the portfolio companies maybe a little bit later, and this is a region for me and a lot of the Indian I think VCs, because many of them come from my mold, studied in US, maybe worked in US, and you moved back to India. So there's a US-India corridor in the venture ecosystem, just like Anshuman, worked in US and then, come back, join a startup, which is very strong. So our Silicon Valley Connect and the US Connect is very strong. But for the venture capital industry, the connect into this region is not that strong actually, and historically there hasn't been time spent and hence relationships built, right? And so that's one thing I think will change, has to change, because our portfolio companies want to be here, and hence we have a role to play in some measure, adding some value. So that's one aspect. And then, I think as was discussed before, there is not also a big investor connect into India also. There may be one-off connect, but it's not again organized as it is from sort of the overall US to India, and now in fact China to India also. But from here to India, the investor connect is also not that strong. So, just trying to understand more and learn more and be here more, I think is important to build that corridor.
And I think that's a good segue to the audience, so you can ask us questions. Yes.
I don't need a mic. Can you talk? Zomato coming to the UAE was a big deal. Like when they came and invested, people it was like, wow, Zomato's coming and spending a lot of money. And then Zomato exiting.
Sold.
Yes, that's also a big deal.
Yes.
Can you talk about that in particular? Like what was the response, what was it like, oh wow, those guys, played that game well. Like what was going on there? Break that down.
Tamer, get in line next time, because there was someone else wanting to ask.
Yeah, okay.
We'll have one more question after Tamer's impromptu.
Yeah, well, I think he has a pass to do that, I think, right? So, I think the Zomato is an interesting point, and like that, as Oyo is here. Ola believes someday they will come. At least they have gone to Australia for now, and maybe they can come here, maybe they can't. And I was just mentioning to Binoy that one of our companies, Cult, which is health fitness, is just opened in Dubai. So they see that there is not a significant change in business model to come here, and Zomato opened a lot of eyes and raised a lot of eyebrows. And the selling part also makes sense, because right now for them, they need significant cash infusion. And if you could, I think they got 250 million cash out from having invested here. That's a great exit for any startup, and for them that's just a partial exit, because they just sold their operations in this region, right? And it gives them the necessary cash. And I think sometimes how you can create when you are in a competitive capital market, and they retrenched a little bit to say, I got to put more cash into India. So I think their ability to have come here early, use the same platform for the same service or solution, if you will. Obviously, it has to be localized, but 80% of what they were doing strategically was the same. And to be early here and open a market, not just our portfolio, but I think every one of our early stage portfolios, companies are looking at saying, is this a region where we can be a relevant player? So that also creates a lot more opportunities to collaborate, co-invest, I think. Zomato is a portender early example that has inspired many more companies to want to try it. Obviously, some may fail. So expect a lot more Indian companies to want to do things here soon.
Question from you, sir.
Yeah. So I think you're right about, 3 of my personal investments in early stage companies have actually come here and started operating in the last 2 years. I've helped them come here, and these are early stage tech companies, and they've found this market quite attractive from a unit economic perspective as well. But my question is that, Vani, you alluded at the start of your talk that the Series B and the likes, the growth capital ecosystem is a little bit broken in India. There are not too many funds like the Iron Pillars and the guys who provide the growth capital. So how do you think, in your personal portfolio, in Kalaari's portfolio, in terms of, given the instability in overall macro trends, and how do you advise entrepreneurs in terms of, do they focus on break even so that they kind of make themselves a little more immune to the outside force of capital being required in the business vis-a-vis growth? How do you think about that?
I mean, a couple of things. One is sometimes entrepreneurs say to me, oh, I just want to be done with fundraise. And I tell them, well, you're never going to be done, right? In one form or the other, if you're a CEO, you have to think about access to capital. It may be fundraise, it may be public offering, and post that, whatever. So I think a lot of these companies, if they're going to achieve scale, will continue to look for sources of capital that is somewhat independent from growth and profitability. Of course, they are interlinked, but and so they need to develop a mindset, an attitude, and a team that thinks of this as the most important business development, corporate development activity, function, and create the leadership around that internally. And best of companies do that, and that's also an area where we help. But it's important that they think about capital as being an institutionalized function within the company. So growth capital is available, but the problem is there may be, some entrepreneurs are best set up just from their background and access to get to global capital, and some entrepreneurs are not well set up. And because there isn't enough in India-focused funds on growth capital, they have to learn how to raise that from global capital for sure. Having said that, how much capital is a question, and it has less to do with growth and profitability. It has to do with, first of all, what are the capital markets? Do they allow you a cheaper cost of capital for expansion? If they do, then you should raise that capital. So that's at a macro level true for all companies. But apart from that, it's really, if there is a right unit economics where continuing to put capital and the growth that you drive is really driving real scalability of the business. And and if you have that, and there is a large market, ultimately you will get rewarded for the largest market share, and not necessarily for the best product. Obviously, product is important and it helps you get to the market share, but it's not necessarily always the best product that gets to the largest market share within sort of some boundaries. So I think getting to market share is also a very important thing, but the mistake is throwing capital to get to market share when your core unit economics were never gonna work in no matter at what scale. So that is kind of the nuanced lever, I think. But companies, if they don't grow, then the question of entrepreneur being smart to sell it quickly to somebody else who can put that into a bouquet and grow the business is important.
On that note, we have our cue to close. Thank you, Vani and Anshuman, for being here, and I'm sure they're available later, and we'll be happy. And thank you for your time.